6,000 workers across 9 factories, film on Apollo 11, emulsions that documented 2 world wars, a Queen's Award, and 22,000 dealers spanning the globe. Ilford didn't just make black and white photography, it defined what black and white photography was. Then the ownership changed, and changed again. 5 owners in 45 years, a Swiss pharmaceutical giant, an American timber company, a private equity firm. Each one extracting value, none investing in survival. When digital arrived, there was nothing left to fight with. In August 2004, 125 years of British chemical engineering collapsed into receivership. £40 million in debts, 1,700 jobs at risk. The original factory demolished, replaced by a supermarket, its car park awaiting a 36-storey tower. But in a Cheshire village, 6 managers and a global army of photographers who refused to let it die saved what remained. This is the story of a man, a teapot, a basement in Essex, and the company that grew from it, how it conquered the world from darkness, how it was lost, and what the darkness still keeps alive. Chapter 1. The Teapot and the Basement. The story begins with a scandal. In the late 1870s, a professional photographer named Alfred Harmon abandoned his wife, his 7 children, and his studio in Surbiton, Surrey, and ran off with a Dublin-born widow called Nina Dugay. They moved to Ilford, then a semi-rural Essex village with clean air and a good railway line into London. And there, in the basement of a house called Elmhurst, at the corner of Cranbrook Road and Park Avenue, Harmon did something that would reshape British photography for the next century and a quarter. He started making photographic dry plates, with a teapot. Harmon wasn't a scientist. He had no formal training in chemistry. What he had was 20 years of hands-on experience as a working photographer, the kind of Victorian artisan who'd learned his chemistry through trial, error, and ruined plates. He'd been in the trade since he was 21, running a printing partnership in Peckham, advertising enlargements under his own name. He understood what photographers needed because he was one, and what photographers needed, desperately, was freedom from the wet collodion process. Before gelatin dry plates, taking a photograph meant coating a glass plate with chemicals, exposing it and developing it, all within about 15 minutes, before the collodion dried. Every landscape, every portrait, every expedition required dragging a portable darkroom, a tent, trays of chemicals, and a prayer for steady hands. The breakthrough had come in 1871, when Dr. Richard Leach Maddox published a gelatin-based process, and in 1878, when Charles Bennett discovered that prolonged heating of the gelatin emulsion massively increased its sensitivity. Dry plates could be made in advance, stored for weeks, and were roughly 60 times faster than wet plates. Photography could finally leave the darkroom. Harmon saw the commercial opportunity and seized it with both hands. He employed 2 men and 3 boys. He applied his emulsion formula to glass plates using that teapot, pouring carefully in total darkness, working by touch alone. He delivered finished plates to London dealers daily, loading them onto a horse and trap for the journey down Cranbrook Road. He wasn't the first. Rutton and Wainwright of Croydon and Mawson and Swan of Newcastle were already established. But Harmon brought something his competitors lacked, a fierce, almost reckless commercial instinct. By 1883, he'd built a purpose-built factory on the Clyde estate in Ilford. By 1884, he'd diversified into photographic papers. By 1885, he'd lost a trademark dispute with his London distributor over the name Britannia, and his response was characteristic. He renamed his plates Ilford, slashed prices by half, and introduced a paddle steamer trademark that would identify the brand for nearly 60 years. If he couldn't keep the old name, he'd make the new one famous. The company was registered as Ilford Photo Britannia Works Company Limited in December 1891. Record profits came in 1897. And in 1898, Harmon sold his controlling interest and took the company public for £380,000, a considerable fortune in Victorian money. His key hire was Edward Ball Noble, a chemist and former head brewer at Bass & Company, who also happened to be a noted amateur astronomer. twice president of the Royal Astronomical Society. Noble brought scientific rigour to what had been, until then, a brilliantly instinctive operation. Then came Kodak. In 1902, George Eastman himself approached with a merger proposal, essentially a takeover bid. The directors persuaded Harmon, who still held substantial shares, to reject it. Kodak tried again in 1903. Both approaches failed. It was perhaps the most consequential refusal in British photographic history. Ilford would remain independent and British. The British Journal of Photography described Harmon as obviously a man of great determination, who, though he lacked scientific training, must have been a good practical experimenter and researcher. He died on 23rd May 1913, aged 72, leaving an estate of £266,000. His house, Elmhurst, the basement where it all began, was demolished in the 1930s. A pub called the Cranbrook was built on the plot. Chapter 2. The Empire in Darkness. Under Chairman Major General Sir Ivor Phillips, Ilford grew from fewer than 300 employees into something altogether larger. Between 1919 and 1930, the company absorbed roughly a dozen competitors in an aggressive acquisition spree. Thomas Illingworth and Company, Imperial Dry Plate, Gem Dry Plate, the entire Amalgamated Photographic Manufacturers, Consortium in 1928, and Wellington and Ward of Elstree around 1929. Each takeover brought factories, formulas, customer lists and, critically, the 1928 acquisition of Raja brought a factory in Mobberley, Cheshire. A rural site tucked into countryside, concentrating on photographic paper manufacture. Nobody knew it then, but that Cheshire factory would one day be the only thing left. The product innovations came fast. HP plates arrived in 1931, hypersensitive panchromatic, the name itself a promise. HP roll film followed in 1935 at 160 ASA, alongside FP film at 28 ASA for photographers who traded speed for exquisite grain. X-ray plates had been in production since 1907, quietly building Ilford's dominance in medical imaging. But the year that truly secured Ilford's technical supremacy was 1940. In Ilford's research laboratories, chemist J.D. Kendall discovered the developing properties of phenidone, a compound with 10 to 18 times the efficiency of metal, lower toxicity, and none of the agonizing dermatitis that plagued darkroom workers' hands. Ilford patented it, trademarked the name, and phenidone became the foundation of virtually every developer the company would produce for the next 6 decades: microphen, bromophen, multigrade developer. It transformed developing chemistry industry-wide. And in the same year, remarkably during wartime, Ilford launched the world's first variable contrast paper, multigrade. One box of paper, multiple contrast grades, controlled by coloured filters. The initial version used just 3 filters and wasn't a commercial success. But the concept would revolutionise darkroom printing when dramatically improved nearly 4 decades later. The wars made Ilford essential. In the First World War, photography was initially dismissed as a luxury trade expected to wind down. Then aerial reconnaissance made it critical. 19 Ilford employees died in service. In the Second World War, the factory came under direct control of the Ministry of Aircraft Production. Ultra-high-speed panchromatic emulsions were developed for night reconnaissance. Massive flares dropped from aircraft to illuminate targets below, the film racing to capture the image before darkness returned. These wartime emulsions directly seeded the superior products that would define Ilford's post-war reputation. Meanwhile, X-ray film production surged. By war's end, Ilford held over 60% of the British medical imaging market. In 1939, the company conducted a mass radiography survey for the Ministry of Health, screening 23,000 Norwegian servicemen for tuberculosis using 35mm miniature film. Over 40 teams were trained and deployed nationwide. Even the factory's bonus garden was dug up for air raid shelters. A German bomb struck the plate stockroom in September 1940. A rocket hit the factory during the Blitz. One worker recalled her boss calmly suggesting they should probably turn off the Bunsen burners. Ilford's emulsions eventually reached beyond the Earth itself. In 1969, Ilford G5 and K2 nuclear research emulsions flew aboard Apollo 11, measuring astronaut radiation exposure through particle track analysis. A company that had started with a teapot, in a basement, was now supplying materials to NASA. Chapter 3: The Kingdom of Red Light. The Ilford works operated under conditions unlike almost any other factory in Britain. Because silver halide emulsion is destroyed by light, the entire core of the manufacturing process, mixing, coating, handling photographic film and paper, took place in complete darkness, or under the dim, amber-red glow of safelights. Imagine arriving for your first shift. You'd walk through the gates into a world that looked ordinary enough from the outside. Victorian brick, loading bays, the usual industrial clutter of a factory site. But step through the light-sealed doors, and you'd enter something else entirely. Darkness. Not the comfortable darkness of a cinema, but the working darkness of a place where people performed complex, physically demanding tasks with no visual reference at all. Workers in the coating rooms operated entirely by touch. A visitor to the Mobberley plant put it perfectly. If you asked the staff who worked in the light-sealed rooms to show you what they did with the lights on, they'd have to close their eyes. They'd never seen their own hands at work. The air carried a particular chemistry. Stop bath, dilute acetic acid, filled the darkroom with a sharp vinegar tang, the smell that defined the trade. Fixer, sodium thiosulfate, carried a mild sulphurous edge, almost ammonia-like. Developer had its own faint chemical signature. Anyone who ever printed a photograph on Ilford paper in a school darkroom or a converted bathroom at home remembers those smells with absolute precision decades later. One photographer captured it. The moment your nose picked up those aromas, you were suddenly absorbed into a world of creation. The chemicals weren't pleasant exactly, but they were specific. They were yours. They smelled like the particular magic of watching an image materialize from nothing. And that was the thing. That was the experience Ilford sold, though they never quite put it in those terms. You'd slide a sheet of multigrade paper into the developer tray, that heavy, satisfying weight of fibre-based paper, its emulsion velvety under your fingertips. You'd rock the tray gently, agitating the chemicals, and under the amber glow of the safelight, which silver halide paper couldn't detect, you'd watch. First nothing, then grey shapes emerging like ghosts, then contrast building, shadows deepening, highlights clearing, an image appearing from white paper as if summoned by the chemistry itself. 30 seconds, a minute. The photograph arriving. That was real. That was physical. That was something a screen would never replicate. Inside the factory, the manufacturing process began with silver halide crystals, principally silver bromide, dispersed in gelatin, mixed in total darkness. Raw emulsion was stored in cold rooms in a gelatinous state. Research scientists tested each batch for granularity, hardness, and photographic characteristics before it was approved for production coating. Film and paper bases were then fed through massive coating machines at extraordinary speed, up to 3,200 meters per minute, receiving multiple layers of chemical compounds and emulsion in sequence. The machines were legendary. Coating machine 14, actually the 13th, the workers didn't want to call it number 13, was physically transplanted from the original Essex factory and rebuilt at Mobberley, where it still runs today. Two of the last few machines of their type surviving in the world tended in near total darkness by workers navigating with red-bulbed torches. Coated film travelled between buildings in massive steel containers the workers called coffins. Light-type metal boxes moved across the site on trolleys. Quality control staff checked enormous rolls by hand, examining strips from each end for scratches, repeat marks, and coating uniformity. The early factory conditions had been brutal. Darkrooms poorly ventilated and desperately hot, workers fined for falling asleep. Cyanide handled in the laboratories with the antidote kept in the same room. By the 1970s, conditions had improved, but the fundamental strangeness remained. You worked in darkness. You made your living from light's absence. At its peak, Ilford employed over 6,000 people across factories in Ilford, Brentwood, Basildon, Leighton, Watford, Cricklewood, Park Royal, Edmonton and Mobberley, plus subsidiaries in Switzerland, France, Australia, Denmark, India and the United States. By 1964, the company had 22,000 authorised dealers and 2,000 dealer agents worldwide. The paternalistic employer culture that Harmon had established in 1891, when he built the Britannia Works Institute on Ilford Lane, with its sponge, billiard room and kitchen, persisted for generations. Avril Nelson, who worked in the computer department from 1969 to 1983, remembered it clearly. They were a good employer, they looked after people, families had always lived and worked there, and they were proud of it because Ilford was a prestigious name. Christmas dances at the Ilford Palais, organised theatre trips to London, long service ceremonies where decades of loyalty were formally acknowledged. Multi-generational employment was common. Families defined themselves by their connection to the works. The products that emerged from that darkness became the standard of the art. HP5 Plus, the best-selling black and white film in the world, loved by press and documentary photographers for its extraordinary latitude. Pushable from ISO 400 to 3200 and beyond. FP4 Plus, luminous tonal rendering and fine grain for the patient craftsman. The Delta range, introduced in 1990, with revolutionary core shell crystal technology, tabular grain emulsions yielding finer grain at any given speed than traditional films could achieve. And multigrade paper, dramatically reimagined in 1978 with 11 filtration grades, became the standard darkroom paper in photography schools and professional darkrooms across the world. No other company offered such a complete ecosystem for black and white photography: film, paper, chemicals, and the technical manuals to use them all. The Ilford Manual of Photography, first published in 1890, ran through 5 editions as essentially the photographer's Bible. Don McCullin, Britain's greatest war photographer, shot his career-launching photograph of a Finsbury Park gang on Ilford FP3 in 1958. He remembered the film specifically decades later, a very slow but very fine film. Filmmaker Ken Russell shot most of his photographs on what he called good old reliable FP3. The brand didn't just serve photographers, it defined what black and white photography looked like. Chapter 4. The Summit Before the Fall. The absolute peak can be dated with precision. In 1975, Ilford received its second Queen's Award to industry, export growth exceeding 50% over 3 years, export sales risen from roughly £7 million. Chief Executive T.W. Parton received the award at Mobberley. In 1976, HP5 launched at Photokina to universal acclaim. In 1978, the 11-filter multigrade paper cemented Ilford's dominance in every serious darkroom on the planet. In 1980, XP1 arrived, the world's first commercially available chromogenic black and white film, processable in standard C41 colour chemistry at any high street lab. Genuine paradigm-shifting innovation from a company at the height of its powers. But standing at that summit, nobody inside those walls could see the cliff edge. In 1976, the original Ilford factory in Essex, the works Harmon had built, the site where it all began, closed permanently. The last plates were coated on the 11th of November 1975. The site shut in February 1976. Mary Davis, who worked in the Roden Street offices, remembered the date with grim precision. Friday, the 13th of February. The emotional heart of the company was torn out. The factory was demolished. A Sainsbury's supermarket opened on the site in 1985. A car park covered the ground where a century of chemical engineering brilliance had taken place. And in 1979, silver, the raw material without which Ilford could not exist, began to destroy the company's finances. The price rocketed from £3 per ounce in January 1979 to £23 per ounce in January 1980, an 8-fold increase driven by the Hunt brothers' attempted corner of the global market. For a manufacturer whose products literally contained silver, the impact was catastrophic. The financial losses triggered restructuring, retrenchment, and the beginning of a corporate ownership carousel that would, over the next 25 years, pass the company from hand to hand like an unwanted inheritance, extracting value at every turn, investing almost nothing back, until there was barely anything left to save. The works that revealed the world to itself was about to disappear into darkness of a different kind entirely. Chapter 5. 5 Owners and a Funeral. The ownership carousel began in 1958, when Imperial Chemical Industries acquired a 32% stake and effective control of Ilford, seeking a platform for colour photography research. 5 years later, Swiss chemical giant Cyber AG began acquiring shares to co-develop cyberchrome, a silver dye bleach colour printing material. In 1967, ICI and Cyber jointly acquired all remaining shares. In 1969, Cyber bought out ICY's stake entirely. Ilford was now a subsidiary of a Basel chemical conglomerate. The following year, Cyber merged with J.R. Geigy to form Cyber Geigy, and Ilford became one small division within a corporate structure whose interests ran to pharmaceuticals, agrochemicals, and plastics. Photography was a footnote in the annual report. Cyber Geigy rationalised without sentiment. The Ilford Essex site was closed in 1976. The Basildon headquarters followed between 1981 and 1983, consolidating everything at Mobberley, whose workforce trebled to approximately 1,500. By the late 1980s, the Swiss parent had concluded what it had probably suspected for years. Photography was not a core business. In 1989, Cyber Geigy sold Ilford to International Paper Corporation of America, which merged it with graphic arts manufacturer Anitech to form Ilford Anitech. The logic was diversification into imaging. The reality was that a timber and paper company had no more idea what to do with a photographic emulsion manufacturer than a pharmaceutical giant had. International Paper sold Ilford Anitech to Doughty Hanson and Company in 1997 for £85 million. Founded by Nigel Doughty and Richard Hanson, Doughty Hanson was a British private equity firm operating a classic leveraged buyout model. Their 1997 fund was €2.7 billion. Ilford was a financial position, not a passion. It sat in a portfolio alongside food companies, healthcare firms, and battery manufacturers. Under Doughty Hanson, the company was rebranded Ilford Imaging Limited and attempted a digital pivot. Printasia for consumer inkjet paper, Gallery for the higher end. In 2002, plans were announced to sell the original Rajar portion of the Mobberley factory for housing development, to raise capital. A company selling part of its own factory floor to keep the lights on in the rest of the building. Compare this with Fujifilm. When the digital tsunami hit, Fujifilm's president Shigetaka Komori launched the Vision 75 plan in 2004, diversifying aggressively into cosmetics, pharmaceuticals, flat panel display materials, and medical imaging. Revenue grew 57% by 2010, even as Kodak's fell 48%. Fujifilm reinvented itself because its leadership understood that survival meant becoming a different company entirely. Ilford had no such champion. 5 owners in 45 years. ICI, Cyber Geigy, International Paper, Doughty Hanson. Each one extracted value, loaded uncertainty, and disrupted whatever long-term strategy the previous owner had begun. No owner invested in transformation. For every parent company except perhaps ICI, photography wasn't the business, it was the asset. And assets, eventually, get liquidated. Chapter 6, 20 August 2004. The digital revolution didn't creep in, it detonated. In 1999, the Nikon D1 arrived, the first affordable professional digital SLR, at roughly $5,500. The Canon EOS D30 followed in 2000. Global film sales peaked in 2001. By 2002, digital camera unit sales had surpassed film cameras worldwide. American 35mm film roll sales collapsed from 718 million rolls in 1999 to an estimated 186 million by 2006. a 74% fall in 7 years. In January 2004, Kodak announced it would stop marketing traditional film cameras in Western markets. The entire industry was in freefall. Kodak would eventually close 13 film plants, shutter 130 photo finishing facilities, and lay off 50,000 workers before filing for bankruptcy in 2012. Agfa divested its consumer imaging division in November 2004. The resulting Agfa Photo went bankrupt within 7 months. Konica stopped producing film around 2006 and merged with Minolta before exiting cameras entirely. An industry that had existed for over a century was functionally destroyed in less than a decade. Ilford's position was uniquely exposed. The 1976 retreat from colour film meant the company's entire commercial existence depended on black and white materials, a niche within a collapsing market. The inkjet paper pivot was a derivative play, coated papers rather than transformative technology, utterly insufficient against the scale of what was happening. There was no digital camera development, no software platform, no medical imaging pivot, and the private equity ownership structure prioritized financial returns over the kind of expensive, radical reinvention that survival demanded. On the 20th of August 2004, in the company's 125th anniversary year, Ilford Imaging UK Limited entered receivership. Debts of £40 million. Joint administrators Mark Byers, Malcolm Shearson and Les Ross of Grant Thornton were appointed. The Mobberley factory at that point employed approximately 1,700 to 1,800 people. Every one of their jobs was at immediate risk. The timing was savage. 125 years of British chemical engineering, photographic innovation and manufacturing excellence, from Harmon's teapot to Apollo 11, brought to the edge of total extinction in the same year the company might have celebrated its greatest milestone. The Swiss operations at Marly, near Fribourg, were offered for sale. The Mobberley site. The equipment, the coating machines, the formulas, the irreplaceable tacit knowledge locked inside the heads of workers who'd spent decades operating in darkness. All of it was now at the mercy of administrators, whose job was to recover money for creditors. Workers faced the prospect that the building and everything in it would be sold off piecemeal, and the business that had rightfully carried the name Ilford for a century and a quarter would simply cease to exist. Chapter 7. The Orders that Saved a Name. What happened next shouldn't have worked. 6 former managers of Ilford Imaging organised a management buyout. It would take months. It would require courage, financial creativity, and something no spreadsheet could quantify, proof that the world still wanted what Ilford made. Stephen Brierley, the sales and marketing director, described the critical moment years later. He rang all his customers. His colleague Simon rang all of his. The message was simple and direct. If you care about the black and white products, if you care about Ilford, now is the time to place a big order. And the orders poured in. Enormous orders from all over the world. Photographers, darkroom printers, schools, universities, professional labs, a global community that had built its craft around Ilford products and flat out refused to watch them die. It wasn't panic buying. It was a rescue mission, conducted one purchase order at a time. The MBO completed in February 2005, reportedly just hours before the PMA photography trade show opened. The new company was named Harmon Technology Limited, in honour of the founder. Key figures included Howard Hopwood, Peter Elton, Giles Branthwaite, and Brierley himself. Professional advisors from Deloitte and law firm Halliwells shepherded the deal through. To finance it, the Mobberley factory site was sold to a property subsidiary of the Perviaz Navid Family Trust, with Ilford remaining as tenant. A painful concession, trading ownership of the building to keep the business inside it alive. The official statement captured both exhaustion and defiance. The company had been overwhelmed by the loyalty of staff, customers and suppliers, and Ilford Photo held without doubt the strongest brand in monochrome worldwide. What the buyout saved, the Mobberley factory. The complete black and white product range, HP5+, FP4+, Delta 100, 400 and 3200, Pan F+, XP2 Super, SFX2, 200. Multigrade papers. all chemical lines. The Ilford brand name for black and white products. What it couldn't save: scale. From 1,700 employees, the workforce fell to just over 200. Approximately 1,500 jobs were lost. The Swiss operations at Mali were sold separately to Oji Paper Company of Japan in July 2005, passed through another owner and went bankrupt in December 2013, costing a further 220 jobs. The MBO had saved the heart. Everything around it was gone. Chapter 8. What darkness keeps alive. The logic behind the buyout was simple and, in retrospect, prophetic. The 6 managers believed that black and white photography would endure, not because the technology was superior to digital, but because it wasn't a technology at all. It was a craft, an art form, a physical, chemical, sensory experience that no screen could replicate. They were right. In September 2015, Harmon Technology was acquired by Pemberton Ventures, a UK investment company. CEO Mark Anslow spoke of the potential of the analogue photography movement and described Harmon as uniquely placed to drive the resurgent film market. Pemberton invested what it called multi-million pounds in operational and research capabilities. Under managing director Greg Summers, Harmon Technology today employs over 200 people at the 48-acre Mobberley site and produces more than 1,000 products. The company claims nearly 90% market share in black and white photographic papers. Exports account for 85% of output, shipped to over 80 countries, with 45% sold in the United States. In 2007, Harmon acquired Kentmere Photographic, a Lake District paper manufacturer, moving production to Mobberley and launching budget-friendly Kentmere 100 and 400 films. In 2012, a £350,000 investment brought 35mm cassette-making equipment from Italy's Ferrania, ending half a century of dependence on external suppliers. In 2024, the company announced its largest investment in film manufacturing since the 1990s. 2 new converting machines that will more than double cassette production capacity. And in December 2023, Harmon launched Harmon Phoenix 200, the first colour-negative film made entirely from emulsion to cassette at Mobberley. A company that had retreated from colour in 1976, that had nearly died in 2004, was now expanding into territory it had abandoned almost 50 years earlier. The market has grown at roughly 4 to 5% annually over the past 8 years. The people driving that growth are not the photographers Harmon would have recognised. They are 18 to 35, born into digital, raised on smartphones, saturated by screens. They seek the tangible, the deliberate, the imperfect. As Summers describes them, they are people for whom taking photographs this way is an antithesis to digital, an opportunity to step back, slow down, take time away from a screen. They queue for film at specialist shops. They pay premium prices for expired stock. They share their prints on social media platforms, using digital networks to celebrate analogue craft, an irony that would not be lost on the Ilford workers who handled cyanide in the dark. The film revival mirrors the vinyl record renaissance, something that was declared dead, dismissed as obsolete, abandoned by every rational business analysis, surviving because human beings are not entirely rational, and some experiences cannot be reduced to convenience and efficiency. Inside the Mobberley factory, coating machine 14, the one transplanted from the original Essex works, the one that should have been numbered 13, still runs in near total darkness. Workers still navigate by red-bulbed torches. Greg Summers has spoken about conducting knowledge capture and succession planning, deliberately ensuring that the irreplaceable tacit knowledge of veteran workers, many in their 50s with decades of service, passes to a deliberately young research and development team. The knowledge of how to mix, coat, and finish photographic emulsion cannot be written down completely. Some of it lives only in the hands that have done it for 30 years. If that chain of transmission breaks, no amount of investment can rebuild it. Meanwhile, in Ilford itself, the Essex town that gave the company its name, a visitor today would never know the history. The original factory site at Roden Street is a Sainsbury's car park, awaiting demolition for a development called Chapel Place, 837 residential homes, 447 student accommodation units, 7 buildings, up to 36 stories. The architects have promised to name public spaces after the factory. A gesture. The Redbridge Museum holds the Ilford Limited Archive on the second floor of the Central Library. Cameras, plates, film, oral histories. In 2022, the Eastside Community Heritage Project organised events on the roof of the Sainsbury's, showing visitors photographs of the factory that once stood exactly where they were standing. History viewed from the top of its own grave. The Papermakers Arms pub still stands at the corner of Riverdene Road and Roden Street, the only surviving structure from the factory era. And at Mobberley, in 2016, a planning application to build 375 homes on the majority of the factory site, consolidating Ilford onto a smaller campus, was refused by Cheshire East Council and rejected at public inquiry. The factory that the original town couldn't save was preserved by the community of its adopted village. A company born in a basement, built in darkness, nearly destroyed by the light of a digital screen, saved by 6 managers, a global community of photographers who refused to let it die, and a Cheshire village that wouldn't let developers take the ground from under it. 200 people, 1 factory, 1,000 products shipped to 80 countries, the world's last complete black and white photographic manufacturer, still coating emulsion in the dark, still making materials to capture light while working in its absence. The teapot is long gone, but the chemistry remains.